just to put a little bit of context around why I do what I'm doing before I get into the meat of the content. About 5 years ago, I'm 55 now. About 5 years ago, when I turned 50, I started with a hot flush on my birthday. That was a nice present. But actually, what happened for the next 2 years was I really struggled with menopause related symptoms, which, if I'm honest, at the time didn't realize they were menopause related. There's a distinct lack of education for women. It's great to see a couple of men on this call. And we were just talking a few minutes ago about the fact that, men don't go through this. So they really probably have more of a vested interest in finding out because they're not going to experience it. But the reality is we as women don't get educated about what's going to happen. So when it does hit, it can be a massive surprise that, some of my symptoms weren't what I recognised stereotypically to be menopause symptoms. So yes, I got the hot flush, but actually I realised for many years before that, probably 5 years before, I'd been dealing with anxiety that I hadn't had in my life before. I was dealing with brain fog that at times left me thinking I had early onset dementia, and my stress or my ability to cope with stress was really impaired. So there was lots of things going on. Very long story short, I ended up sort of struggling for 2 years. I worked for the MOD. I worked for 32 years for the MOD, 30 of which was at RAF Wittering. So I don't know how local we all are to this area, but I worked for the RAF for 30 years. And we had no policy in place for menopause. There was no training or anything like that. There was no education for female employees. There was no education for managers. So when I was struggling, I didn't get the help or the support that I needed. And if I'm honest, I didn't ask for it because I didn't know what I was going through. And I requested 12 months special unpaid leave to help me get over some issues that I was dealing with. It was rejected because of financial constraints. And I ended up resigning in March 2018. And through a very strange twist of fate and an irony that probably won't be lost on you, a former colleague of mine from the MOD gave my name to Air Command, which is the Air Force's head office down at High Wycombe, because they were looking for somebody to deliver menopause awareness training. There's a bit of a backstory there to how I ended up getting the knowledge to be able to do that. My background was in learning and development, so that kind of came together. So I ended up delivering 2 workshops around menopause in the workplace to managers and to colleagues at Air Command on World Menopause Day, which is the 18th of October, 3 years ago. And since then, I've worked across all sectors, across a huge range of different businesses, from large global corporates right down to local dental surgeries, to raise awareness of the issues that women go through. Not all of them, but that some women can go through as they're kind of going through that menopause transition, and the role that the workplace can play in helping to support women to stay productive and performing as well as they can in their job, because there's a vast number of women doing what I did and walking away from the workplace. So that gives you a little bit of context to why I do what I do. And if I can just share my screen, I'll just pull up some slides. I am very relaxed about these sessions. What I can't do on Teams is when I share, I can't actually see anybody. So what I would like is to make it as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, Janine, I don't know if you're able to manage the chat function and see if there's any questions or thoughts come up in the chat. Just feed them through to me. But it's a lovely small little group, so if anybody's got any questions, please just do come off mute and just shout out at me, because I can't see you. So if you put your hand up or anything like that, I don't know whether it's the way I've got it set up for Teams, but I don't see anything. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering, we're going to look at what menopause is, because I think for a lot of people, they just don't know, me included. So it's certainly not a male thing that you don't know about it. We'll talk about what menopause is, when and why it happens, some of the symptoms and the impact of those symptoms on women, not just in the workplace, but across the board. We'll look a little bit at the business case, why businesses might want to be supporting women and why it's in their best interests. Then I've got a little bit of sort of further help and signposting for you at the end of the session. So hopefully that sounds okay, and it sounds like something you'd be interested in. And the fact that you're here, I'm hoping that is an indicator. So I'd really love to ask you, have we got, is everybody here, Janine, from Marshalls? I'm a bit confused.
No, we've got one visitor with us, Leslie.
Okay, thank you very much. So I guess the question to start with is, where would you put your organisation at the moment with regard to menopause? Where zero is, we've never even thought about it. The conversation's never come up, right through to a 10, which would be, yeah, we've got a policy in place. We've got a great open culture where everybody talks openly about menopause. We've got training in place for all of our staff. Where would you put yourselves at the minute in terms of your organisational awareness around menopause? So if you can just stick a number. I wonder if I can. I definitely can't see the chat.
We've got a 0 from Les.
Okay. And
Another 0 from Paul. I would say 0 too, to be honest.
okay. Well, I'm gonna
Zero.
give you a little bit of a leg up, because the very fact that you're on this call means you're not a zero, you're already at least a one, because you started the journey, and hopefully whatever you pick up from today, you've got the potential to feed back. So you're not alone. At the moment, it's reckoned that about 15% of businesses in the UK are actively or proactively doing something to raise awareness of menopause. So that's still a very, very low number. It's almost like, I guess it's the next mental health in the workplace subject. It's kind of it's just growing in I was going to say popularity, that's probably the wrong word, but it's growing in terms of relevance. I think people are starting to talk more about it. Certainly in the last year, I've seen quite a sea change in the amount of conversation being had around the subject of menopause. So if we start with the terminology, because I think it's really important to understand the definitions and the different sort of stages that women go through throughout their reproductive life, and where menopause fits in. So if we start with the word menopause itself, it's just one day in a woman's life. So a woman is classed as having reached menopause when she's been 12 months period free. So 12 consecutive months period free. So she's not going to actually know she's reached menopause until she looks back retrospectively and realizes she hasn't had a period. Anything between puberty and that sort of one day, 12 months after her last period, is classed as premenopausal. So while she's in her normal reproductive years, she's premenopausal. Anything after that one day of menopause, for as long as a woman lives, she's no longer having periods. She's classed as being postmenopausal. Where the problems come for most women who do struggle with menopause symptoms is during a period of time called perimenopause, which literally just means around the time of menopause. And it's generally about 4 to 6 years before menopause and potentially a few years post-menopause. For some women, it can be up to 10 years before that day of menopause. So if we put some sort of times and ages around this, it's really difficult to be definitive, because there's nothing about menopause that is definitive. There are so many variables. But the average age for a woman to go through menopause in the UK is 51. But that's a bit of an arbitrary figure, really, because there are so many variables. But a woman would be classed as having a normal menopause if she stopped having periods anywhere between 45 and 55. That's the sort of expected age bracket. So we tend to stereotypically think of women in their 50s, starting to go a bit grey haired, wafting themselves with bits of cardboard or whatever they can get hold of to cool themselves down after their hot flush. But in reality, what is often happening and is going unnoticed a lot of the time is younger women starting with perimenopausal symptoms. So if you think that perhaps you've got a woman who is maybe 46, who has been without, period free for a year, she's still within the normal expected age range for menopause. but she could have started her perimenopausal symptoms up to 10 years before that. So we're not necessarily anymore looking at women in their 50s. We're potentially looking at women in their late 30s, early 40s who are starting with those symptoms. And a lot of the time, it's not the hot flushes that are the first symptoms to happen. It is often the more psychological and cognitive symptoms, such as anxiety, low mood, tearfulness, brain fog, poor memory, poor concentration. And they're the symptoms that kind of creep in a bit insidiously and can leave women feeling very vulnerable. They can feel almost like they're losing competence, like they're not performing as well as they used to. And that can obviously lead to confidence issues as well. And I think a lot of the time, the reason it's such an anxious time is because we're not necessarily aware that they are symptoms of what is, in effect, a very natural part of the female life cycle. So we don't want to be potentially seen to be struggling, so we bottle things up, we don't talk about it. In a lot of organizations, talking about menopause is still quite a taboo subject, so it's embarrassing for women. They don't want to be judged, they don't want to be seen as failing in any way, so they kind of internalize all of that angst, which just, of course, adds to the extra stress. So there are other reasons as well why women might go through an early menopause. They may have surgery or be being treated for a medical condition, specifically cancer, which can bring on an early menopause. So if you've got women who are having either a partial or a full hysterectomy, by full hysterectomy, I mean it includes an oophorectomy where they remove one or both ovaries, she is very likely to either be plunged straight into full menopause, or she's likely to experience an earlier menopause than she would have done ordinarily. And there is also a condition called POI, premature, I'll try that again, premature ovarian insufficiency. We don't quite know why it happens. It affects about 1% of women under the age of 40. They basically go through a natural menopause much younger than that normal expected age range. It could be an autoimmune response, it could be genetic, we really don't know. But as I say, it affects about 1 in 100 women under the age of 40, about 1 in 1,000 under the age of 30, and about 1 in 10,000 under the age of 20. So whilst we may have assumptions and stereotypes about women going through menopause, women of a certain age, actually menopause can strike at any time, at any age in a woman's life, sort of from puberty onwards. So that sometimes comes as a bit of a surprise to people. Any surprises there for anybody?
Not so much for me, Bev. I popped it in the chat earlier. Unfortunately, I come from a family where menopause is quite early. So my nan actually was classed as having gone through her menopause at 38, and my mum was 42. So
yeah,
being in my early 40s, I know it's something that's probably around the corner for me soon.
Potentially. There's often a family or a sort of familial pattern, but it doesn't always happen, which is that's where there's no sort of definitives here. You might find it doesn't affect you, but being prepared is always helpful. And I think, I've spoken to many women who've gone through an early premature menopause, and they've given, told me stories about, when they've tried to explain to their manager or to their HR department that they're going through menopause, and they've almost been dismissed as, well, you can't possibly be, you're far too young. Which, of course, if you're already struggling with the realization that, this is happening early, and there are longer term sort of health implications of being of menopausing early, to have your condition dismissed as, almost like you're fibbing, you can't possibly be telling the truth, is something we need to just be aware of, that we can't make assumptions at all about when a woman will go through menopause. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important that we do know that women can go through at any age. In terms of symptoms, then, this is another assumption that we tend to make if we're not careful. We assume that all menopausal women are going to get hot flushes and get snappy and be tearful and cry for no reason. In reality, about 25% of women won't have any symptoms at all. They'll just sail through their menopause. They'll look back, realize they haven't had a period for a while, and possibly wonder what all the fuss is about. And in actual fact, I've come across a number of people who've said, they've had a manager who went through menopause symptom-free. And as a female, where they thought they might get some empathy and perhaps a little bit of understanding because of their menopause, because she'd not experienced any symptoms, can be quite unsympathetic. So it's really important that we realise that we are all built differently, and it's not a foregone conclusion that just because you've experienced menopause in a certain way, everybody else will. We are all so different. About 75% of women will have some degree of symptoms. The severity will vary over the sort of the transition. The type of symptoms may come and go, and the severity and the duration may change, and it'll be different for everybody. And about 1 in 4 at the other end of the extreme are likely to have quite severe debilitating symptoms. And for women who are plunged into an early menopause through surgery or through chemotherapy or something like that, they can find that their symptoms are very severe because there's been a bit of a hard stop on their estrogen levels. So there are actually 34 recognised symptoms of menopause, and they are very broad in their nature. I'm finding it really hard. I've been studying menopause now for the last 5 years. I can't find 2 experts who agree on what the 34 are. One expert will give you one set of 34, and then another expert will give you another set of 34. There are certainly some common themes that sort of recur. We can kind of categorize those symptoms into 3 areas. So you've got your physical symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and emotional, psychological ones. So if we think about the sort of the common ones, I guess, the ones that we're aware of in terms of physical symptoms, we're mostly familiar with hot flushes and night sweats, and we might be more familiar with things like migraines and headaches. Generally, we're aware that a lot of women, when they're going through that perimenopause period, will have quite erratic periods. They may not be behaving the way they were when they were younger. A lot of women, some women find that their periods just get lighter and lighter and disappear. Many women, the majority I would say, find that it's the opposite, because estrogen has a bit of a blood clotting property to it. When that estrogen level starts to drop, a lot of women find that they have extremely heavy, erratic periods that can lead to flooding and a lot of discomfort and embarrassment and humiliation if they're caught out and have a flood when they're not expecting it. Other things that kind of fit with the physical symptoms are things like very itchy skin, almost like insects crawling under the skin. A lot of women talk about. It's got a proper name. You just have to be a little bit careful how you say it. It's called formication, but it's with an M. Just be careful how you say it. Osteoporosis, low bone density, is quite common in postmenopausal women because estrogen supports bone tissue. Other things are things like urinary tract infections, recurring urine infections. We'll get the elephant in the room out of the way because it's always a difficult one to talk about, but vaginal dryness and vaginal discomfort are massively problematic for a lot of women, certainly post-menopause. About 70% of postmenopausal women have some degree of vaginal discomfort. Other things, what have we got? We've got things like restless legs, dry eyes, bleeding gums and a metallic taste in the mouth, heart palpitations, leg cramps, muscle cramps, joint ache. It's quite worrying when you think of the sort of the vast range, and the reason there's such a big range of symptoms is because we have estrogen receptors on pretty much every cell in the body, on every tissue in the body. So as our estrogen levels decline as we go into perimenopause, so that perimenopause period is the time when our estrogen levels and our progesterone and other sex hormones start to decline as we head towards no longer being able to produce eggs. That because of the nature of the role of estrogen and in sort of brain health, heart health, tissue support, obviously the sex organs as well are affected. It can have a massive range of symptoms. When we think about the cognitive ones, a lot of women find that they get brain fog, which is a bit of a sort of an umbrella term for things like poor word recall. I'll be amazed if I get through this session without forgetting at least one word I need to say. So word recall is a problem. Short-term memory loss can be a real problem. Just trying to remember your best friend's name or your child's name. Simple words can just be sort of it's almost like the connection doesn't happen between the brain and the mouth. Concentration issues can be a problem. Sequencing, so being able to kind of put things in sequence and think logically, can be a bit distorted. And this is where a lot of women, if they're not aware of this as a perimenopausal symptom, can really worry that they're getting early onset dementia. And then we've got the emotional and psychological symptoms. So anxiety and depression are very common in postmenopausal women. There's a real link between mental health or poor mental health and menopause. The highest incidence of suicide for women is between 48 and 54. That it's hard to not make that connection with the fact that that's also the most common age for women to reach menopause. Also things like rage, anger, loss of sense of joy for life, apathy, lethargy. A lot of this is to do with the fact that our hormones like to be in balance. So as our sex hormones are declining, it can have a corresponding impact on things like our serotonin levels and the mood hormones. Also things like cortisol. So women often find that they don't deal as well with stressful situations as they did pre-menopause. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that women in particular, when you've got that sort of imbalance in hormones, find that their cortisol response, their stress response is likely to be about 3 times higher than a male's stress response at that same period of time. So there's loads going on, a lot of things to deal with. As I've said, the good news is not all women will get all of the symptoms. Not all women will get any of the symptoms, but some women will be plagued by very, very many of them. And in the workplace, this is really where we need to be aware of what's going on, not making assumptions that somebody is menopausal or that their symptoms are menopause, but just being understanding. I think there's two words that are, or two phrases, I guess, that I like to apply to menopause in the workplace, which are compassion and common sense. If we can be compassionate about the fact that this is a natural change that has some very unnatural side effects for a lot of women. And especially now, probably more than ever before, because many women are working at levels that are much more senior. There's a lot more responsibility. There's a lot more stress involved in their work. And whilst it's not going to be true for everybody, I think we've seen, especially in the last 18 months, unfortunately, the bulk of the caring responsibilities still do tend to fall to women. So whilst we have equality maybe in the workplace, I'm not sure we still have equity, or we've got that equity yet that makes it a particularly sort of balanced split between the workplace and home and all of the other bits that are going on potentially. So if you think about all of those symptoms and they don't scare you too much, just have a think about the impact that they're likely to have on a woman's life, really, in all aspects of her life. If you've got women who are potentially very tired, they're not sleeping well, they've got insomnia, they've got night sweats that are keeping them awake at night. We all know the correlation between poor sleep and stress. If you're stressed, you don't sleep well. If you don't sleep well, you tend to be more stressed. If you also add into the mix the fact that that woman may well be putting weight on where she's never carried weight before, so her body shape might be changing. She may be struggling with vaginal discomfort. That might be having an effect on her libido. Lowering testosterone levels might also impact on libido. If that's not being communicated very well with her partner, that could obviously lead to relationship issues. It can have a massive effect on her self-esteem. Social life, a lot of women say they just don't feel like they want to socialize. They don't feel like they're great company. They might be exhausted. They don't want to be going out socializing. And that can also lead to a feeling of isolation. So there's a lot of stuff going on. This is where the kind of the mental health side of things can be impacted as well. So what I wanted to do was just get you to kind of save listening to my voice constantly. Just have a think. Anybody want to have a think about how those symptoms and the breadth of those symptoms might impact women, particularly their performance within the workplace? As I say, I can't see anybody, so please do just shout out.
I think a lot of it, Bev, was what you were just saying about your ability to cope with stressful situations, or perhaps your patience might be a bit more stretched than it normally would be in certain circumstances. You might be a bit more reactive, a bit more emotional to things.
And how might that impact the workplace?
Just affects those that are around you, I guess, in terms of them thinking, oh, what's going on with her at the moment? She's a bit more reactive or ratty or whatever. So it can impact your relationships, I guess.
Yeah, I think the last thing we want is to have team members walking around on eggshells, being frightened to speak for fear of getting their head bitten off. And we have got a tendency to do that at times. The trick is not to take it personally, but yes, without that understanding and awareness of what might be going on, which is where the conversation around menopause really does start to break down some of that misunderstanding and leads to greater tolerance and better sort of workplace morale, workplace relationships. So yes, certainly it can have a wider effect on the rest of the team. Anybody, thank you for that. Anybody else think of anything that it could impact, or how it could impact? That was a very well worded question. Hopefully got what I meant. How it might have an impact.
I think Marian's got a hand up.
Yes, I've experienced this in meetings because for the nature of my job, I'm I can be talking to several different people in a day, and then I need to go into an important meeting to present something, and I've literally probably only just spoken to some people in a meeting before, and I get to that meeting and I can't remember their names. So yeah, and then so because of that, you sort of sit there and you feel like an idiot, and then you also then bring on a hot flush as well. So yeah, I've experienced that firsthand.
Yeah, and you hit a really good point there, actually. So the memory starts to go. You can't remember the simple names, and that leads you to feeling. It creates a feeling in your body of, oh my gosh, the anxiety starts to rise. And the last thing you want when you're about to have a hot flush is for your body temperature to be going up. And when we get anxious, it's our fight or flight response, which is basically warming the body up to either run away or fight it out. So yeah, you've got that sort of compounding that can lead to a hot flush. What might help, do you think?
It's difficult to say. Just yeah, to explain that that you might need to refer back to somebody, or just give them a minute, or come back to them. Yeah, that's what I have to do sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that easier if you're in an environment where you feel comfortable to be able to say, do you know what? I'm just having a moment. Give me a second. I'll be back on it in a second.
Yeah. I say that. Sometimes the nature of the meetings can be quite sort of pressured, and so yeah, that tends to make it work. But I do my best to sort of say, just give me a moment and carry on. I'll come back to that in a second. So quickly trying to recall.
And I think as women as well, if we've always been able to kind of, I don't want to say multitask, because I don't think anybody can truly multitask, but we can certainly switch between tasks quite quickly. It's the way our brains are made. And as we go through that menopause transition and the hormone balance changes, we lose a little bit of that capacity to be able to sort of switch tasks very quickly. So we'll possibly find that a lot of our colleagues have never been able to do the things we were able to do quite naturally. And it's that feeling of change, that feeling of, I always used to be able to hold everything in my head and now I can't, therefore I must be failing. In reality, it's not a failing. It just means that we may have to find different ways different strategies to help us to remember. And technology nowadays is massively our friend. You know, I'd be lost without a Google Calendar sending me reminders of where I'm meant to be from 1 hour to the next, because I wouldn't remember. Voice notes I find are really, really helpful for me, because as soon as I've spoken to somebody, I'll speak, well, once they've moved on, I'll often get my phone and voice memo what it was about, because I'm not great at taking notes. So there are things that we can do. But I do think having an environment where it's okay to acknowledge that this is happening makes it takes away that fear of being judged, and it takes away the humiliation of having to admit that maybe you need a little bit of extra time or you need a little bit of extra support. And I think it's quite easy to put a label on saying she's menopausal, she's going to be a problem because she's got all these sort of things going on. In reality, there's no evidence whatsoever at all, I need to stress this, that our intellect or our intelligence is impaired. It's a bit like dyslexia to an extent. It's not an ideal analogy, but you know, somebody with dyslexia, it's not an impairment of their intelligence. It's just that the way they process information through the brain takes a different route. And I think that's what's happening when we go through that perimenopause phase in terms of brain fog. So tolerance is massively helpful. What about the gentleman in the room? Do you have any thoughts on how these symptoms might impact in the workplace?
Sorry, Bev, I think Leslie's had her hand up for a little while.
Oh, sorry, I can't see anybody. I do apologise.
No worries. Hi, Bev.
Hi.
So I tried to use my comment box earlier, but I'm on a tablet and I'm struggling to use it correctly. But I'm the 1% who actually got POI. I was 36, so it was a bit of a shock going through an early menopause. And obviously I've carried on working through that. And I think the biggest thing I've had, and it kind of echoes what Marion was saying, is brain fog. And where that really has impacted on me, and really where I've had to kind of rely on my colleagues, is in presentations. So I do an awful lot of presentations for work, and there was one day where I basically went in to do a presentation for new business pitch for somebody's website, and I just completely lost my train of thought, and it never came back. And I just sat there for 20 minutes in this horrible hot flush, with my shirt sticking to my back, just in this awful panic. And I was just babbled for 20 minutes with no idea what I said. I don't think I made any sense. And my colleague who was with me didn't know what I was going to be saying. So she was trying to fill bits in, but wasn't really sure what was happening to me. I wasn't sure what was happening to me. Mm. So I think the biggest thing for me, and how it's impacted the workplace and how to kind of work around that, is I very much work more in a tag team now with my colleagues. And so they'll very much know what I'm going to be saying in my presentation. So if I get in that situation again, where I do just completely forget my train of thought, then they're able to pick up or fill in and interject. And also I tend to have notes, written down next to me now. Yeah. And also what you said, I couldn't survive without my Google Calendar, reminders set for everything, diary entries for everything, adding things into, remember to phone somebody, call my mum, whatever. So it's a new way of working, but it's, there's definitely ways around it. It's definitely manageable. So
yeah. And I think the big thing is, once you're aware that what you're going through is slightly abnormal for you because you were very young. But generally speaking, it is normal. These hormone changes are normal. They don't normally happen that young, but it is normal. It's interesting actually, because when I look back to my husband is an engineer, but he's always had lists and he's had strategies for remembering things. And I can remember when we were a bit younger, he would, he'd make his lunch for the next day. He was in the Air Force. He'd make his lunch for the next day, and he'd put his beret in his lunchbox with his keys, and he'd put that by the back door, and I'd be like, what are you doing? It's like, well, if I don't, I'll forget my beret or I'll forget my keys. And I couldn't get my head around why you would need to do that, because my memory was so good. I was so sort of competent at being able to remember all these things. And of course, when I went through my own sort of menopausal changes, I don't wear a beret, but if I did, I'd probably use that strategy now to remind myself. So I think a lot of the times we're quite hard on ourselves because we think it's a failing, when actually, if we look around and look at the evidence, a lot of other people are doing these things already. They have those strategies in place, and we've not needed to, so we don't think we have to, or we think we should be able to manage without them. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing that, Leslie.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I'm not letting the boys get away without saying anything. So do any of our gents want to chirp in?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think the first comment is I just quickly worked out roughly when my mum might have gone for it and what age I was. I think I probably owe her a phone call and apology, because I was probably a nightmare at the time. But if you don't have awareness of it, like you say, then it's kind of you're a bit lost without knowing it. So I might have to give her a call. I think the second thing is, I had a day of brain fog yesterday, as Louise will attest to, and that was just one day. Wasn't particularly happy about it. So just for me, putting that into scale, again, an awareness piece of what one day did to me of having brain fog and getting lost in invoice numbers and things like that, and not knowing quite where I was and being up to my usual speed, what that had on my mood and how valuable I felt yesterday. Scaling that more than a day into years just makes my mind go a bit boggled.
It's really interesting you say that. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that anybody who's struggling or suffering from long COVID are having very similar symptoms to brain fog, male and female. And it'll be interesting to see if the fact that it's now medicalized against against COVID, if they do more to look at what's going on, because brain fog does affect everybody. We don't tend to hear so many men talking about it, but everybody loses their place at a presentation from time to time. Everybody has that kind of muddy thinking, but it's more pronounced, I think, as we go through that perimenopause period. But thank you for that, because I think that's possibly quite a good insight for you, maybe, that you've experienced it, and on a small scale, what must it be like if this is, for some women, they'll be going through this perimenopause period for sort of 10-15 years, and it can be quite traumatic, I think, sometimes. So thank you, I really appreciate that. Anybody else want to jump in before I move on?
I think you kind of touch on the point, Bev, in what you just said, but nothing that's on there, say nothing. There's a few things on there which are unique to women, but much of the stuff on there actually applies to men equally. So it's, I think, trying to put yourself in that person's shoes, a bit of empathy will make a big difference. Massively.
Yeah, and I think you are right. It's there's a danger in what I do, that I kind of marginalize and label women with menopause and the symptoms that go with it. And you're absolutely right. They are symptoms that are potentially felt by people at any age. We talk a lot about women in menopause struggling with fatigue and insomnia and struggling to cope because they're exhausted. But if you've got a new dad with a new baby and they're not sleeping, they're going to have that same sort of level of exhaustion. So it is across the board. I think what is slightly different when it comes to menopause and women is the intensity, because of the falling estrogen levels. It's like it happens with a bit of a kind of a more at a more intense level. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Right. So what are women saying? There's been loads and loads of work done over the last few years looking at surveys and studies asking women how they experience menopause, and particularly how it affects them in the workplace. And these are probably the three bits that stand out for me. 45% of women say that it strongly impacts their life and has had a negative effect on their work. Since that statistic came out a few years ago, actually, there's been some work done by Vodafone. There's been quite a massive study done by Vodafone, and their study suggested that's nearer 90% of women have said that it has a negative impact on their work, most of whom will not mention it. They won't talk about it. They say they want a boss, a manager who's aware of menopause and the symptoms, and they want to be listened to without judgment. And that comes back to what you just said about that empathy. You know, it's realistically what we need is just people to be understanding that this is something. It is a transition. It will pass, but it might take some years to pass, and we just really need to be understood. And it's the awareness that will kind of raise that understanding and hopefully lead to that greater empathy. I have to say, you know, I would have been guilty of this. I was, as a manager in my 30s, I don't think I would have been very sympathetic towards older women because I didn't understand it. I wasn't educated. I didn't know. Lost my mum when I was 22, so I didn't see her go through it. So I think raising awareness for everybody across all parts of the business, so senior, junior, male, female. And while I'm on the subject of male and female, I talk in these sessions about women, really for ease of flow of the conversation, but just be aware that it is a transgender issue as well. So if you've got anybody within your employ who has menstruated at any time in their life, regardless of what gender they identify as now, if they've menstruated at any time, they may well go through menopause. So it is a bit broader than just women, but as I say, for kind of flow of the conversation, it's sometimes easy just to refer to women because they are, you know, the majority of people that will be affected. Why do we need to talk about menopause as a workplace issue? I don't think it's something that was talked about much 5 years ago. It's definitely getting more prominent nowadays. There was a government report commissioned in 2017 looking at the impact on the wider economy of the sort of participation of older women in the workplace. And there were a few interesting stats came out of that, as well as some work done by the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development and ACAS and some of those other large organisations. And when you consider that there are there's nearly 4.5 million women over the age of 50 in the workplace now. That's a 72% increase in the last 25 years. So we are taking up a much greater space in the workplace, that we are the fastest growing sector of the labour market, and about 80% of women who are experiencing menopause are in work. So we need to be aware that we're taking up a big bit of space in the labour market. The worrying statistic here, and I don't like to be a statistic, but I fall into this stat, is that it's estimated that between 10 and 30%, we can't really quantify this accurately, but between 10 and 30% of women have considered leaving work due to their menopause, either because they didn't realize it was menopause, didn't ask for the help, which is a bit like my situation, or they fear judgment. They fear that they're going to be in some way disadvantaged, maybe not be considered for promotions. They maybe don't feel like they've got a relationship with their manager that they can talk about it to get the support, maybe workplace adjustments that they need. So they'd rather leave their job than seek help. It may be that they don't even know. Certainly when I left my job, I didn't raise the subject of menopause. I couldn't have done because I wasn't given an exit interview, but I probably didn't at the time realise that the bulk of what I was dealing with could have been sorted if I'd understood more about menopause. I had a brilliant boss. He was a 27-year-old man. He was absolutely brilliant, very supportive, but had no education whatsoever in menopause. So it never really came up with him either. And if we consider that it costs on average around about £30,000 to £35,000 to replace a vacant manager post, it doesn't take a huge amount of mental arithmetic to figure out that 20% of 4.5 million women costing 35 grand a pop is going to be quite a big impact, not only on the economy, but also on businesses as well. So what can you do from an organisational point of view, I guess, to support women in the workplace going through menopause? Well, The CIPD have put out some very clear guidance, as have some of those other organisations, as I've mentioned. The first thing they talk about is having clear policy or guidance documents, and there's no legal requirement at the minute for a business to have a menopause policy, although there is a private members bill going through Parliament. If it's approved, it will mean that businesses with 250 or more employees have to have a dedicated menopause policy. I sit on the fence a little bit. I'm not sure that a policy on its own is anything much more than a tick box if it doesn't form part of a wider sort of awareness campaign. And I think for certain organisations, maybe a policy isn't the right route, maybe just a guidance document or a page on an intranet site that signposts and gives it sort of better resources. I knew I'd forget a word before the end of the session. There it is. Lost my train of thought. So maybe an intranet site might be just as helpful as a policy. I think what a policy does do, though, is it gives the message that as an organisation, you value your female staff and you recognise the impact of menopause. For me, and I guess maybe this is a bias because I'm a trainer, I do think that awareness training is massively important for all staff, male, female, young, old, senior, junior. It does impact everybody, even if you don't experience it personally, it does impact everybody. And raising awareness through training, whether that's formal training or informal messaging within the workplace, really does help to get the conversation started. It helps to break the ice. It helps to get people talking about the subject. And in organisations that I've worked with who have done some training, what they've found is it's been a little bit of it's the start of pushing the snowball down the hill, and it's gathered momentum from the people within the workplace, because it's almost like women have been given permission to talk about what they're going through. Including menopause and health and wellbeing campaigns can be really helpful as well. Just it keeps that messaging going. And then, of course, we're looking at workplace adjustments, reasonable adjustments to help support women. Most of the time, the workplace adjustments are fairly simple and, if not cost neutral, very cost effective, very low cost. So things like having a desk fan or considering relaxing uniform restrictions. If you're looking at potentially at a bigger scale, what sort of materials are your suppliers using for uniforms? Are they natural fabrics? Are they wicking fabrics that can potentially help with hot sweats, or are they synthetic fabrics that are exacerbating the problem? Things like technology we've already spoken about, having equipment available maybe for things like having voice recording software or something like that might help. And then there's things like being able to have flexible working where it's appropriate, maybe work from home options. Of course, COVID has kind of pushed this a lot forward a lot more quickly. A lot of women have found that the work from home, not having that commute, has been really helpful. Other women I've spoken to, I spoke to somebody just last night, said actually working from home wasn't great for her because she felt very isolated and it was having a negative impact on her anxiety. So when we look at reasonable adjustments, we've got to really look at what works best for that individual, because there's no one size fits all. And that leads to the next point on the slide, really, that we need to acknowledge that every woman will experience menopause in her own way. And then obviously, if you're looking at policy, being able to use that as an opportunity to signpost either women to get the help they need, or your managers to get the support that they need to be able to manage somebody effectively. How are we doing for time? Just realise I'm doing quite a bit of talking here. Quickly, so going through the legal responsibilities, I suppose, from an organisational point of view, at the moment, menopause isn't a protected characteristic in its own right. Again, that's being debated at the moment. I sit on the fence again around whether I think it should be. At the minute, it is kind of protected under age, sex and disability. But if we think that we now know that Menopause can happen at any age. It's not completely one sex, and it's certainly not a disability in its own right. It does bring up the question, well, should it be a protected characteristic in the way that pregnancy is potentially? I shall leave you to decide on your own thoughts around that. But we do need to be careful that we're not either directly or indirectly disadvantaging women. And one area that this often happens is in sick absence reporting. So if you think about that range of symptoms I mentioned earlier, if you've got a sick absence reporting system that categorizes every single symptom separately and doesn't have a kind of an umbrella coding for menopause, then you could potentially be treating women who are going through menopause, which is one condition, disadvantageously if you're treating every single bout of sickness that may look unrelated but actually are related. So that might be something to think about. And then in terms of health and safety at work, if you've got safety critical tasks, if women are handling machinery or any kind of sort of high risk activity, you should really be looking at a risk assessment that assesses the impact of menopausal symptoms. Now, that's not to say that you should have a risk assessment specifically for a woman who could be menopausal, because she may not know and she may not want to disclose it. But looking at those symptoms when you're raising risk assessments and considering them can be really helpful. In terms of what the benefits are for the business, there are loads. You know, from an organizational point of view, you're looking at better employer brand. Certainly if I was going for a job at 55 and I got the offer from 2 different jobs, one of whom was obviously menopause friendly and the other one wasn't, I know which one I'd go to. So from a retention and recruitment point of view, there are benefits. Absenteeism, presenteeism, improved morale. You know, there's loads of reasons why supporting women in the workplace through their menopause transition makes good sense, not least of course it's the right thing to do because we're dealing with people and people have different needs. So there's very many reasons, not least of which is that if somebody's performing well and they're happy in their job and they're staying in their job, it's going to improve productivity and profitability. We do know from studies that have been done that where women are in the workplace and you have that diversity, most businesses are more profitable. So how can you help at a practical level with reasonable adjustments? Well, there's lots you can do. This is not an exhaustive list at all, but there are some patterns that can help. You're going to get this as a video. If you want, Janine, I'm very happy to send these slides through as a PDF so people can see the table and also the links to further resources so you don't have to go and find them. But in terms of where you can get more information if you need it or if you want it, obviously you've got my website at there. There's some stuff on there. CIPD have some really great guides for people professionals and also for people managers. ACAS have some good guidance. Faculty of Occupational Medicine, or if you have access to occupational health, they can often give you some good information. And then the British Menopause Society is the leading authority, I guess, in the UK on menopause from a clinical point of view. But in terms of female support, they also have an arm called the Women's Health Concern, which you can access through the website, that has lots and lots of really good accurate information about menopause, when it happens, why it happens, what you can do to treat it and manage it. And then just finally, if you're interested, I have a workplace checklist to kind of give you a starting point to do a quick audit on where you're currently at. I know many of you said you were at a 0. It kind of looks at 4 different areas. It looks at the culture within the organisation, the systems and processes, training and the environment, to see basically what you're doing well, what's going, you know, what you've got in place that is working to help women and where you might want to focus your efforts in the future. And the QR code is scannable. It's quite easy to get a copy of the download. And that, I'm very conscious I'm probably running out of time. So if I stop sharing that and come back into the room, How are we doing? Oh gosh, Janine, I'm so sorry. I have run it to the quick there. Has anybody got any thoughts or questions?
No, I think that's really useful. Thank you, Bev.
You're very welcome.
I think for me, I was a bit of a late joiner, and I'm sorry for not being in here at the start, but I think it just raises a level of awareness for me that I probably never had. You know, I think my wife is probably on the start of this journey at the moment, and I think it just puts things into perspective.
That's great. That's great. Do you feel a little bit more confident about potentially sort of talking about this then?
I think I think better understanding. I think is you know, it's the start of that process for me. I think having a better understanding, and but yeah, no, thank you. Really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome. Anybody else got any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I'd just like to say I'm really pleased to see this this initiative and being thought about in our business, because it really helps, and I tell you what, it really helps just sharing experiences with other people as well.
Hugely.
That's something that I find really is good. Just knowing that someone else is going through the same as you, and you're not mad, you're not alone.
Yes.
Really,
yeah, it is. It's that almost that sort of problem shared as a problem halved. I found a lot of organisations that I've worked with, if they've gone on to create sort of, I don't want to say menopause groups, because I think often it's a bit too narrow, but they've set up sort of women's support groups, and menopause has been something that people can discuss. That social support, that sense of not being alone through this, it's really hard to overestimate the power of that, just not feeling alone.
Yes,
yeah, brilliant. Any more? No. Well, hopefully you found it helpful. Janine, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Bev. I think it's definitely something I haven't really thought a lot about, but as I'm heading towards 40, I need to start thinking about it more. So it was really helpful. The brain fog side of things slightly terrifies me, but
all I would say is, coming out the other side now, it's not to be feared. It's don't think I'm too sort of woo-woo here, but I kind of think of it like going into a chrysalis. We've kind of been caterpillars, we're going into this chrysalis, going through a bit of a metamorphosis, and we do come out as butterflies. It's not the end of the world. There is life after menopause, so don't fear it. Leslie, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that as well. I think there's so much kind of negative press around menopause and the symptoms that happen, and that actually it really should be a time for kind of embracing and kind of liberating in a way, that suddenly we can then understand what's happening to our bodies and we can take control of that. And I think there needs to be, you know, kind of education for women and for men earlier on. And Janine, you're right, you know, start now and get on the right path, because that's only going to help you as your hormones change. I wish I knew about it much earlier, but obviously I was very early when it all happened to me, so I'm slightly a different case. But the stuff I know now is certainly, you know, a very approach, and it's all complete. It is manageable. You know, some women will have horrendous symptoms and they'll be really bad. Other women will sail through it, but on the whole, yeah, let's not fear it. Let's make it more of a positive experience and support everybody, really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. Thank you.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will wish everyone a lovely weekend. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Bev. Thank you.
Thanks.